me at the session. It's really interesting, and it's quite funny that Adam and I have very parallel work, but based on different data sources. And I'm kind of relieved to see that we have similar results, but we have a slightly different focus in our work. So I hope it will still be interesting. So this is ESRC funded research with my colleagues Emilia, Laura and Angus. And we're also looking at the school closures and learning across the two lockdowns. I'm trying to, oh yeah, okay. So as Adam said, the school closures shifted learning to children's homes, and it's expected that this will exacerbate inequalities. And we have much more information about the inputs than we have about the outcomes, really, because national testing finished with the pandemic, but we have some emerging evidence about disadvantage gaps widening between pupils from different backgrounds. And it's important to understand the channels that contributed to this widening, if it has happened. And so we look at the learning inputs by schools, parents and children during the two UK school closure periods. And we think it's quite important to look at all of these three actors. How did they respond to the challenge of distance learning across the two closure periods? How did this differ by socioeconomic background, and how did it change over time? Those are the main questions that we're asking here. We're using the Understanding Society COVID-19 study that we produced in-house in Essex. We have the UK Household Longitudinal Study Understanding Society, and the sample was there ready to be used when the pandemic struck. And so then we implemented an online survey of the main sample, which ran monthly from April 2020 and bi-monthly thereafter. And we used data from two separate waves, similar to what Adam was using. We have one survey relating to April 2020, the first period of school closure, and the second one was in January 2021 relating to the second period. And importantly, we also have school codes collected here, and we use this to link information on school characteristics, which we can only do for England because of the available information that's out there at the school level. So the inputs that we observe by schools are the number of live real-time lessons that we call online lessons, and then also the number of worksheets, assignments, or other kinds of materials given to the children, which Adam maybe referred to more as passive inputs, and we call them offline lessons. For parents and children, we have time parents spend helping children, and we have time children spend doing schoolwork. And we also know what other free resources they were finding to help their children that were not provided by schools. So materials, apps, exercise books, and so on. And we can distinguish whether these were free or they were paid for. And paid for then also includes online tutoring that some children received. So I will start just describing the inputs by those different actors and their course time. So I'm starting with the provision by schools. We have here the primary schools, and then we distinguish the two closures and also distinguish online and offline lessons. And you can see that both online and offline lessons offered increased in primary schools between the two lockdowns, from less than one online lesson to more than just 1.5, so increase of one lesson a day, and also one piece of offline lesson a day increase between the two lockdowns. And this, as Adam mentioned, is most likely related to the legal obligation to provide a certain amount of schooling which came into effect for the second lockdown. In secondary schools, we see that online lessons were about 1 a day, and they increased to 3 a day, whereas offline materials remain stable at about 2 a day. Looking at parent and child time investments, here we have parents in green and child time in orange. And we can see that in primary school, both parents and children spent about 2 hours each in the first closure. And this increased by the second closure, especially children's time went up by 1 hour a day. And in secondary school, we have this difference between how much parents and children spend doing schoolwork. And we see by the second closure a big increase in child, but not parent time, because these children obviously are of an age where they can learn more independently than primary school children. And quite interesting, the use of additional learning resources not provided by schools. We find that in the first closure, a large proportion of parents and children sought out these additional resources, 60% of the population. And this went down by the second closure, and similarly in secondary schools, about half used additional resources in the first lockdown and fewer in the second lockdown. The orange bars are paid for resources, including tutoring, and we can see that this didn't change so much. The number of users didn't change, the proportion using. We don't know about the how extensive that was. So the number of hours might have gone up. And I think this is what Adam's presentation just suggested. But the users are fairly stable over time. So this is just a description of what happened. And because we're interested in widening inequalities and any socioeconomic gradient, we're now looking at the correlates of these inputs. So what factors are associated with these inputs? And we're starting with primary school inputs. One thing to say, this is for English schools only because we have school characteristics for them, and it's only associations. In the top here, you see so what we show is the number of online lessons, what factors lead to more or fewer lessons being offered. We have school characteristics, offset grades, and also the pupil composition, so the proportion of students on preschool meals. So this is characterizing to an extent what Adam might refer to as poor and rich schools. And it's quite notable, we showed the first and the second closure. The one thing that stands out, these lines where they cross the zero line is not statistically significant. And in fact, there are quite few things that predict the number of online or offline lessons offered. Most of these things have the confidence interval crossing the zero line. You have a relationship with maintained schools offering fewer online lessons than academy schools, for example. But then if you look at offline, that relationship isn't there anymore. And I'm not going to show you the secondary school inputs for time reasons in detail, but just as a summary, we see that very few school level characteristics actually help explain the number of offline and online lessons offered by schools. And any associations that we do find are not systematic across lockdown, school phases, or types of lessons. And a large proportion of variation remains unexplained. So our research shows that we cannot pinpoint a typical school that was or wasn't offering, and it suggests that other unobserved to us factors were pivotal in the school's provision of distance learning. So this might be proactive head teachers or anything else that we don't observe. Looking at the parent and child time inputs, first we are looking at primary schools here, and on the left-hand side you have parent inputs, on the right-hand side child time. So both of this is time. And we relate this to individual and background characteristics. So we have gender, the age of the child, whether the parent is single, education of the parent, household earnings, quartiles, work situation, and ethnicity. And again, if you look down here, the factors that are crossing the zero line are quite a lot of them. What we do see is that parents help less if children are older. That kind of makes sense. And we also see that in both lockdowns, families of Pakistani, Bangladeshi ethnicity help less than white ethnicity parents. But there isn't, if you look at the things that signify socioeconomic background, so education and earnings, there's not much there at all to explain the amount of time parents took helping their children. For the children, it's a little bit different, and this is also what Adam showed previously. So first we show that the children work more if they are older, but we also find here that household earnings are positively correlated. So children in richer families working more time. And there's a little bit of a a negative relationship again with Pakistani, Bangladeshi ethnicity. Looking at the same thing in secondary school, again, parental time inputs, there's not much there by background. They help less if the child is older, that makes sense. Looking at the child's own time, we have one aspect is that boys seem to work less from home than girls, so there's a gender angle here. We have some differences across child's age and also ethnicity, but they are not the same across the two periods of school closure. The one thing that we find again for these children is that higher earnings, and in this case also lower educated parents, lead to children investing less time. So in summary, inequality in time inputs for the parents, we find that they help more for older than younger children, are lower for older than younger children, and we find the Pakistani Bangladeshi angle, but we don't find any systematic association with socioeconomic background. And this is different for child time investments, where we do find that SES gradient to an extent, and also the fact that boys work less than girls. But again, a high proportion of time inputs remains unexplained. For the additional learning resources, we have different similar graphs, but I won't show them here. We found that the use of free learning resources was really widespread and not strongly correlated with any family background for children of both the ages that we look at in both closure periods. So again, kind of a surprising lack of an SES gradient there. We do find that gradient in the use of paid for learning resources, but these did not increase much over time, as we've shown. So now we're going to look at how the different inputs interact, specifically how families reacted when school inputs increased. So these graphs, what they show you how the change in inputs by families react to the changes of inputs by schools. So how to interpret this, you have here primary schools, and on the left-hand side, online lesson. For each additional online lesson offered by a school, how much did parents in the green and children in the orange increase their own time input? And the same for offline lessons. And we find that actually the child time reacts quite strongly to more inputs being offered, and the parents' time reacts particularly to offline lessons, where online lessons, I guess they can sit back more and don't have to do as much. And in secondary school, we find that the students react to extra online lessons offered. So this really made them work more. And the parents in that case do less than before, but also offline materials offered lead to more hours per day worked. So the main point here is that in primary school, all the lessons increase children's time and parents' time as well, with the smaller effect of the online lessons for parents, and the increase in school lessons from the first to the second closure fully explains the time increase by parents and by children. So it's the additional offer of lessons by schools that made parents and children work more. In secondary school, online lessons in particular were successful in driving up students' time and more so than offline, but online lessons crowd out parental help. If we want to look at this use of additional resources, we see here that extra online and offline lessons offered have a negative effect on the probability of using free resources in the green. So this strongly suggests that there were substitutes. Families were seeking out these free resource lessons. They used them less. And in secondary school, we find a similar but less strong relationship. And there was no effect of school inputs on the paid for resources. So families who pay for resources do that whatever the schools offer. So these input interactions, what do they tell us? We see that families responded quite dynamically to changes in inputs over time. To begin with, they compensated for lack of school inputs during the first closure period by resorting to free resources that they found elsewhere. Once the schools increased their inputs, the families increased their own time in step with that offer. And online lessons were most successful in engaging secondary schools students' time, but parents then reduced their time accordingly. Looking at differences in this by background, there are more graphs that I'm not going to show you. We find that in primary school, the increase in school lessons offered reduced the socioeconomic gap in learning, and in secondary school it reduced the gender gap in family inputs. So offering more by the schools led to reductions in these gaps by background and gender. So is there a widening of inequalities according to what we can see in the inputs? We find remarkably little evidence of an SES gradient in family inputs into home learning in the inputs that we can look at. Families adjusted quite dynamically to inputs that they were given, and a large proportion of the variation in inputs by schools and families remains unexplained. And so if we do find widening inequalities, we think they may be caused by factors that we do not look at in our research. Adam has spoken about this a little bit already, about the availability of IT equipment. There's obviously a stark difference in housing. Do students find a quiet study space? What's the family finance situation, anxieties at home, abuse as well? What are the differences in parents' ability to help effectively, and the differences in local COVID infection rates obviously made a difference as well. So another thing to take into account, that inequalities may emerge along other dimensions than just socioeconomic backgrounds, and this might be, for example, across gender or previous attainment, and it's important to look at that also. So the policy messages from our work is that given the low level of government investment into catch-up, it seems to be continues to be important to engage families in learning. This might also be important in the future if we have closures for COVID or other reasons. You know, there are closures also because of natural catastrophes and stuff like that, and also if children have sickness absences in the future, or if, you know, what we can learn about online learning has application for future situations as well. And our research suggests that given the right inputs, families across the board, across different socioeconomic backgrounds, will actually engage. The parents will engage with home learning. So this seems to suggest that we need to address the structural inequalities that they face in terms of housing, home environment, and IT provision, and that we need a provision of a high level of resources, because this is what incentivizes and unlocks the engagement in families, with a focus on enabling parents to help effectively and well. And we need to consider cross effects with areas that I've not spoken about, obviously, which is mental health, healthy eating, physical exercise, and all the other things that make learning successful, and that might have inequalities, or we know that quite well as well. So thank you, and I look forward to any questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Birgitta. We have time for one quick question, and then I encourage again everyone to please continue the chat in the chat.